The last tour bus rattles away just as the sun bleeds into the horizon. The chatter fades. Flashing phones and selfie sticks disappear. For the first time all day, the Giza Plateau goes quiet. In that silence, the Great Pyramid stops being a tourist attraction and turns back into what it really is, a question. Because deep inside that mountain of stone, in a place no human has stepped into for thousands of years, something is waiting. Not gold, not a mummy, not some Hollywood-style treasure hoard. A void, an empty space, a chamber that shouldn't exist. And the real mystery isn't what's inside it. It's what its very existence says about everything we think we know about the beginning of human civilization. Here's the part they don't tell you on the tour. The Great Pyramid? It is not done with us. We like to pretend it is. We act like we've already solved it. Mapped, measured, documented. Case closed. After all, people have been crawling around inside this thing for over 2,000 years. Arab explorers broke into hidden passages in the 800s. European adventurers blasted their way through sealed stone in the 1800s. By the 20th century, Egyptologists were calling it fully explored. Every corridor walked, every chamber cataloged. Nothing left but debris, dust, and tourists. That's the official story. Neat, clean, comfortable. But here's the problem. In 2017, physics walked in and flipped the table. An international team called the Scan Pyramids Project pointed high-tech detectors at the Great Pyramid. They weren't looking for treasure. They were looking for muons, subatomic particles born in exploding stars, raining down on Earth every second. They used a technique called muon tomography. Think of it like an X-ray, but instead of hospital machines, you're using cosmic rays. Here's how it works. Stone blocks are dense. They slow muons down. Some muons get absorbed completely. Empty space? Cavities? They barely slow them at all. So if you sit patiently under millions of muons and track where they go, you can build a density map of whatever they're passing through, even something as massive as a Great Pyramid, without drilling a single hole. That's exactly what they did. They put detectors in known rooms. The King's Chamber, the Queen's Chamber, the passages below. Then they waited. For months, those detectors quietly counted particles, like a cosmic drip feed. And then the data lined up. There was a huge void, at least 30 meters long, sitting directly above the Grand Gallery. Perfectly centered, perfectly aligned, perfectly real. This wasn't some little air pocket or sloppy construction gap. On the density map, it lit up like a missing tooth, stone, 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 and then suddenly nothing. Right in a place where no one had ever mapped anything. And that was the moment the story changed. Because up until then, you could kind of get away with saying, sure, maybe there are tiny gaps in there, maybe some minor construction spaces, but there are no secret rooms. After 2017, you couldn't say that anymore. Muons don't care about careers or theories. They don't care what's written in textbooks or carved into museum plaques. They just pass through matter and leave a record. And that record was clear. There's a major unexplored, deliberately enclosed space inside the Great Pyramid. Now, if you're into this kind of thing, hidden chambers, forbidden questions, the parts of history that don't fit neatly into the textbook version, this is where you and I get along. So if you like stories that dig under the surface of the past and ask the questions archaeology politely steps around, you might want to subscribe. Because this channel is where we take those cracks in the official narrative and pry them open. And if you've already got theories about what might be inside that sealed space, drop them in the comments. I read them. A lot of good ideas start with someone asking a stupid question no one else is willing to say out loud. Now, back to the pyramid. Because 2017 was only the beginning. Night settles over the Giza Plateau. The desert cools. The air goes still. The Great Pyramid looms like a frozen memory cut from stone. Too precise to feel accidental. Too old to feel fully understood. Too silent to be comfortable. Beneath its shadow, one question stirs. What if we never actually finish exploring it? For more than 2 centuries, we've been sold a very tidy narrative. You've seen it in documentaries, museum displays, school diagrams. Built around 2560 BC for the Pharaoh Khufu, 4th dynasty. Three main chambers: King's Chamber, Queen's Chamber, Subterranean Chamber. A series of ascending and descending passages. The Grand Gallery with its soaring corbelled ceiling. Arab explorers cracked into hidden passages in 820 AD. Victorian explorers blew holes through anything that looked suspicious in the 1800s. By the mid-1900s, Egyptologists declared the job basically done. Sure, there might be small voids, places ancient builders left empty for structural reasons, but no grand mysteries, no secret rooms, no sealed vaults. The case, we were told, was closed, and that lets everyone move on. You can file the Great Pyramid under solved and focus on other sites. Except then came the muons, and then came 2023. Because the cosmic ray scans didn't just reveal that giant void above the Grand Gallery. Another set of scans focus on the northern face of the pyramid, the side where the original entrance is. There, the detectors picked up something else. A corridor, about 9 meters long, narrow, hidden just behind the outer stones on the north side, near that original entrance. Again, in a place where no one had ever documented a passage. This time, authorities eventually allowed a minimally invasive test. Researchers drilled a tiny hole, about 6 millimeters wide, through a natural crack between blocks and slid an endoscopic camera into the darkness. What came back on the screen was unsettling. Smooth, clean limestone walls, perfectly cut. No soot from torches on the ceiling. No graffiti. No ancient workers' marks. No later intruders' scratches. Just a pristine, untouched corridor, sealed since antiquity. It ran for roughly 9 meters, then stopped at what looked like another blockage, or maybe another space just beyond the camera's reach. The angle of that corridor? Very close to the angle of those mysterious internal shafts that shoot out from the King's and Queen's chambers toward specific stars. But its position wasn't part of any known blueprint. It seemed to belong to an earlier layer of the pyramid's design, one that doesn't match the standard Khufu built-it-all story. Modern technology had just forced open a file we'd stamped closed. Because once you admit, there's a big, unexplored void inside, and a hidden northern corridor carved with incredible precision. You can't just shrug and say, minor construction quirks. You have to ask, if these spaces exist and they don't match the known, documented 4th Dynasty layout, then who carved them, and when? The official answer says, Khufu's builders finished the Great Pyramid around 2560 BC. But the stone itself might be telling a different story. And to hear it, we have to step outside of textbooks and into geology, erosion, and very old myths that might not be myths at all. If you want to know what something is, you ask historians. If you want to know when something has stood under open sky, you ask the stone itself. Because stone doesn't care about dynasties or dates written on papyrus. It records one thing faithfully: the environment it's been exposed to. Rain, wind, heat, time. And when you start reading the rock at Giza, the timeline we've all memorized starts to wobble. In the early 1990s, a geologist named Robert Schoch went to Egypt. His job wasn't to blow anyone's mind. He was there to do a fairly boring thing: confirm the age of monuments using geology. He started with the Sphinx. Now, the Sphinx sits in a carved-out enclosure, a big pit cut straight into the limestone bedrock of the Giza Plateau. The statue itself is carved out of that same stone, and the walls around it are the exposed, raw sides of that excavation. And those walls don't look the way they're supposed to. Instead of neat horizontal scratches from sand and wind, Schoch saw deep vertical channels, grooves running from the top of the walls down toward the floor, some of them so deeply cut you could stand inside them. If you spend your life looking at rock, you recognize that pattern. That isn't wind damage. That's water. Heavy, sustained, pouring down from the sky rainfall. The kind that carves channels as it runs down rock faces, year after year, century after century. Here's the catch. Egypt hasn't had that kind of climate for a long time. Today's Sahara is dry, brutal desert. But it wasn't always like that. There was a period called the Green Sahara, or the African Humid Period, roughly between 10,000 BC and 5,000 BC. when North Africa was full of grasslands, lakes, and seasonal monsoon rains. The heaviest rainfall hit between about 7,000 and 9,000 BC. That's when you'd expect to see exactly the kind of water erosion shock was staring at in the Sphinx enclosure. By the time of Khufu and the Fourth Dynasty, around 2500 BC, that climate was gone. The desert had already settled in. Rain was rare and light, not anywhere near enough over a few centuries to carve deep vertical grooves into solid limestone. So shock came to a simple but explosive conclusion. The Sphinx enclosure had to have been exposed to thousands of years of heavy rain, and that means its original carving dates back long before dynastic Egypt, possibly to 7000 BC or earlier. In other words, someone was cutting massive stone monuments at Giza thousands of years before the pharaohs we learn about in school. You can imagine how well that went over with Egyptologists. The pushback was immediate. Critics argued, those grooves aren't rain, they're wind and sand. Or, it's groundwater. Or, modern damage, restoration, runoff, something local, anything besides ancient storms. But when you line up the evidence, those alternative explanations start to fall apart. Wind-driven sand attacks surfaces horizontally. It creates long, low, parallel scouring, sideways scratching. What shock was seeing were vertical channels, top to bottom. Classic signature of water, sheeting down rock. Groundwater, that leaves its own fingerprints too. Salts, crystal buildup, chemical weathering from below. The patterns in the Sphinx enclosure don't match. And this isn't modern damage. We have photos from the 1800s, before modern construction, before restoration, showing the same deep erosion. We even have medieval descriptions mentioning the weather condition of the rock. So the stone is telling a story. These walls were standing in the open under heavy rain, thousands of years before Khufu. Then shock did something that ramps the stakes up even higher. He looked at the Great Pyramid itself. Not the pretty outer casing that's mostly gone now, but the foundation stones, the lowest courses of limestone sitting directly on the bedrock. And down there, in the oldest part of the structure, he saw similar signs, subtle but clear vertical weathering, not as dramatic as the Sphinx enclosure, but the same telltale pattern of water runoff. These stones looked like they had once stood in a world where rain regularly washed down their faces, a world that had dried up long before Khufu was even a concept. If that's true, then either the Great Pyramid itself, in some early form, was already there during the era of heavy rains, or its foundation was laid in that older climate, and what we call Khufu's pyramid is actually a renovation, an upgrade built over a much more ancient core. Orthodox geologists try to defuse this by saying, maybe the blocks were quarried from old exposed rock that already had erosion on it, then moved into place. But that doesn't really solve the problem. If you take random pre-eroded blocks from different places and assemble them, the weathering patterns won't line up nicely. At Giza, these channels cross multiple blocks in a continuous flow, as if the water ran over them after they had already been placed side by side. In other words, the stones eroded in place, like a wall left under centuries of rain. So now we have a Sphinx enclosure that screams, Age of Rain. Foundation stones under the Great Pyramid that show the same type of weathering, and a climate history saying that kind of rainfall ended thousands of years before traditional Egyptian chronology even starts. At that point, something has to give. Either the geology is wrong, the climate data is wrong, or the timeline of these monuments is wrong. Geology doesn't care about kings. It doesn't rewrite itself when we find a new inscription. So if the stone says older, we have to at least consider that these structures, or their earliest phases, are older than the civilization we've been crediting. And the pyramid's physical structure backs that up in other ways too. If you stand at the base and really look, you notice something strange. The Great Pyramid isn't one uniform piece of architecture. It looks layered. The lowest blocks are huge, heavy, incredibly well fitted. They weathered deeply, like they've been there forever. As your eyes move upward, the blocks get smaller. The fit gets a bit rougher. The weathering looks younger. It's like looking at rings in a tree trunk, except in stone. Older at the bottom, younger as you go up. Architectural surveys have picked up on this. The core masonry, the massive inner blocks, doesn't match the later outer layers in quality or style. Some of those core stones don't even match 4th Dynasty tool marks. In a few rare cases, we see fragments of older inscriptions on blocks buried deep inside the pyramid, as if they've been recycled from even earlier structures. Imagine taking ancient buildings, chopping them up, and using their stones to build a new modern monument around an older core. We know later pharaohs did this all the time, usurping statues, recarving names, claiming older temples as their own. The question is, did Khufu do that on a much bigger scale? Did he inherit something already ancient, add to it, wrap it in new stone, and then history turned around and said, "Cool, we'll just call the whole thing yours"? If that's the case, the Great Pyramid isn't just a royal tomb or a single project build. It's a palimpsest, a monument overwritten across millennia, with each civilization carving its name over the last. And then there's a layer beneath all that, the myths. Ancient Egyptian priests talk about an age they called Zep Tepi, the first time, a golden epoch when the gods walked the earth and built in perfect harmony with the stars. Medieval Arab chroniclers like al-Makrizi wrote that the pyramids were built to preserve knowledge before a great flood wiped out the world. For a long time, those were treated as stories, religious flavor, nothing more. But when the geology, the architecture, and the physics all start whispering, hey, something big was going on here long before 2500 BCE, those old stories start to sound less like fantasy and more like blurry memories. Memories of an earlier world, an earlier builder culture, an earlier catastrophe. And if that's true, then the sealed chamber the muons discovered might not just be extra storage space inside a huge tomb. It might be something else entirely. Something built not for Khufu, but built long before him. And to understand what might be inside that void, we need to go back to where this all started. Not in Egypt, but in the sky. The story of the Great Pyramid's hidden chamber doesn't begin with a shovel or a drill. It begins with starlight. Every second, our planet is bombarded by a storm of invisible visitors from deep space. Particles born in exploding stars, distant collisions, and violent cosmic events. They're called muons. Most of the time, we never notice them. They zip through the atmosphere, through clouds, through buildings, through us, passing straight through solid matter like ghosts. But here's the twist. They don't pass through everything equally. When muons hit something dense, like stone, metal, or bone, they slow down. Some get absorbed. Others keep going, but in smaller numbers. Empty space? Cavities? Those hardly slow them at all. So if you put a detector behind a big chunk of rock and patiently count how many muons make it through from different angles, you can see inside that rock without touching it, like an X-ray. But instead of electricity and machines, your beam is the universe itself. This is muon tomography, a scanning technique physicists originally used to peek inside volcanoes and nuclear reactors. And in 2015, a group of scientists asked a very simple, very dangerous question. What would happen if we pointed this at the Great Pyramid? The project was called Scan Pyramids. Researchers from France, Japan, and Egypt teamed up and brought their detector tech to Giza. They set up different types of muon detectors in key locations, inside the Queen's Chamber, in passages below the pyramid, near and under the Grand Gallery. Then they waited. Weeks turned into months. Millions upon millions of muons flew through the pyramid. The detectors quietly recorded where they came from, which angles, and how many made it through the stone. When they stacked up all that data and turned it into a 3D density map, most of what they saw matched what we already knew. Thick stone where there should be thick stone. Known passages and chambers showing up as low-density paths. Everything looked normal, until they checked the area above the Grand Gallery. There, in a region thought to be solid stone for thousands of years, the map lit up with something impossible. An extended zone of low density. Too many muons coming through. Too little stone in the way. In plain language, there was a void, at least 30 meters long, aligned along the central axis of the pyramid, sitting directly above the Grand Gallery, like a hidden echo of that long, sloping hall. And it wasn't a little bubble or a crack. Its size and shape suggested an intentional space, Architectural, not accidental. Naturally, the team didn't trust this at first. They thought, okay, maybe it's a detector error. Maybe the instruments are misaligned. Maybe cosmic noise. Something. So they checked, then double-checked, then triple-checked. They used 3 different muon detection methods. Nuclear emulsion films, basically photographic plates that capture particle tracks. Scintillator hodoscopes, plastic panels that flash when hit by muons. Gas detectors, which ionize gas to record passing particles. 3 different technologies. 3 different ways of measuring. All 3 showed the same thing. A big, undeniable, empty space where there wasn't supposed to be one. In November 2017, they published the results in Nature, one of the most prestigious scientific journals on the planet. Suddenly, the Great Pyramid was back in headlines. But this time, it wasn't because of some fringe theory or wild documentary claim. It was hard data, backed by particle physics and peer review. The reaction from the academic world? Cautious, guarded, and if we're honest, a bit defensive. Within days, prominent Egyptologists were in front of cameras and on panels saying things like, it might just be a construction void, a structural relieving space, a cluster of small gaps, not one big chamber. Anything to avoid saying the phrase everyone was thinking, undiscovered room. At the same time, Egypt's Ministry of Antiquities moved fast to control the narrative. They acknowledged the discovery. How could they not? The muon evidence was solid, and the world was already buzzing about a secret chamber. But they wrapped that acknowledgement in a heavy blanket of caution. They formed committees. They called for more analysis. They stressed that no hasty conclusions should be drawn. And, most importantly, they made it very clear that no invasive exploration would be allowed. No drilling. No boreholes. No endoscopes poking through tiny cracks to see what's actually in there. The reasons sounded reasonable on paper. The pyramid is too important to risk structural damage. Even small interventions could destabilize ancient stone. It's a World Heritage Site that must be preserved. All fair points. But if you know anything about the history of Giza, you've seen this pattern before. For decades, only projects that fit within the established narrative have moved smoothly. Anything that might challenge timelines, question dynasties, or introduce uncomfortable data tends to get slowed, lost in review, delayed in evaluation. The big void fit into the category of uncomfortable. You can't say it doesn't exist. 3 independent muon techniques say it does. But you can make sure no one is allowed to send in a camera to find out what's inside. And that's exactly what happened. The Scan Pyramids team proposed a series of non-destructive follow-ups. More muon scans from different angles to refine the void shape. Acoustic imaging to ping the cavity and model its dimensions. Ground-penetrating radar to search for connecting passages. Most of these were met with the same answer. Under review. Pending approval. Awaiting authorization. Months turned into years. The void stayed there, confirmed, mapped, completely real, and completely off-limits. Officially, the door was closed for protection. Unofficially, it felt a lot like the discovery had been quarantined. You could talk about it, you could publish about it, but you couldn't actually go there. So the void became something strange. A chamber that everyone knows exists, but no one is allowed to see. What makes it even stranger is the precision. This isn't a random hollow spot where workers got lazy. It sits right along the pyramid's central axis. It mirrors the Grand Gallery in length and orientation. It's aligned like a deliberate architectural feature, not a construction accident. We're looking at a space that was designed, planned, sealed, and untouched since the last block was slid into place more than 4,000 years ago, or maybe even longer, if the geological evidence is right. No torches, no footsteps, no grave robbers, just silence, while empires rose and fell, while languages were born and died, while we went from stone tools to smartphones. That chamber just sat there, waiting. And for the first time in history, the universe itself, those muons raining down from space, let us glimpse its shape. The pyramid had been silent for thousands of years. In 2017, for the first time, it answered back. The real question now isn't, does a chamber exist? We already know it does. The real question is, will we ever be allowed to find out what's inside? Because the story doesn't end in 2017. While the big void was being wrapped in red tape, the researchers didn't give up. They turned their attention to other anomalies in their data, smaller deviations, strange little whispers in the muon patterns. One of those whispers was hiding just behind the northern face of the pyramid, near the original entrance. It would become the next piece of the puzzle. And in 2023, it finally stepped out of the dark. That faint little anomaly near the northern face didn't look dramatic at first. On the muon charts, it wasn't some huge, screaming gap like the big void. It was just a subtle deviation, a tiny region where a few too many particles slipped through. But it was in a very interesting place, right behind the original entrance of the Great Pyramid on the 9th course of stone on the north side. The scan suggested a narrow feature, not a giant hall, but something like a passage, too straight to be a crack, too regular to be random. The data kept saying, there's something there. So the Scan Pyramids team did what scientists do. They went back, refined the measurements, and waited for the bureaucracy to catch up. It took years. But finally, in early 2023, the Egyptian authorities gave them a small, heavily controlled green light. They were allowed to drill one tiny hole, 6 millimeters wide. No more. The team chose their point of entry very carefully. They didn't want to punch blindly into pristine stone. Instead, they found a natural fissure, a place where two ancient blocks had ever so slightly separated over thousands of years. From there, they drilled slowly, carefully, millimeter by millimeter. Stone that hadn't seen the open air since before there was a Rome, a Greece, or even an alphabet crumbled into dust around the bit. At about 9 centimeters deep, the resistance vanished. The drill broke through. Behind that last sliver of stone was empty space. The anomaly was real. They withdrew the drill and prepared the camera, an ultra-thin endoscope with a light and tiny lens, no thicker than a pen. They fed it through the hole into the darkness, and on the monitor a shape appeared. A corridor. Narrow, tall, clean. Smooth limestone walls, pale in the camera's light, stretching away into shadow. No soot from oil lamps. No carved symbols. No scribbled graffiti from ancient workers. No debris, no fallen blocks. No dust pileups from centuries of use. It looked as if it had been finished yesterday and then never touched again. The corridor ran for about 9 meters, almost 30 feet, roughly 1 meter wide, about 2 meters high. Its ceiling and walls met at joins so tight you could barely see the seams. In some places, the blocks fit together with gaps measured in fractions of a millimeter. Not pretty good for the Bronze Age. We're talking modern engineering levels of precision. And at the end, the passage seemed to terminate at another blockage, another wall, or possibly a doorway into something even deeper that the first camera couldn't reach. Already, this was a problem for the standard story. If this corridor belonged to Khufu's known internal design, why didn't he have any records of it? Why was it sealed behind the entrance, inaccessible from every known passageway? Why was it so perfect, yet so utterly unused? Then came the detail that made it even stranger. The angle. This newly found corridor descends at roughly 35 degrees from horizontal. And that angle is very familiar. It matches the steep internal shafts that run from the king's and queen's chambers outward toward the pyramid's faces. Those tight little passages too narrow for a person to crawl through. For decades, those shafts have puzzled researchers. They're too carefully cut to be air vents. They line up with important stars, Orion's Belt, Sirius, Alpha Draconis. So the standard explanation became, they're symbolic soul shafts. A spiritual pathway for Pharaoh's Ka, his life force, to reach the heavens. Maybe, but now, here's this northern corridor. Similar angle, similar precision. But unlike those shafts, it's big enough for a person to walk through. Yet no one ever did. No soot, no footprints. No carved cartouches to brag about which pharaoh ordered it. It's like a hallway someone built and then erased from the floor plan. Or more accurately, a hallway that might belong to an earlier version of the floor plan, one that predates the chambers we know. Because when researchers mapped the corridor's position relative to the pyramid stonework, one thing stood out. It's embedded in the core masonry. Not the outer shells, not the later refinements, but the innermost, oldest stone. Those core blocks are different. They're larger, more weathered, fitted more tightly, and they often don't match the construction style we associate with typical 4th Dynasty work. Some archaeologists have been saying for years that the core looks older than the exterior, as if it's a structure that was once exposed to the elements, then later buried under newer layers. The northern corridor seems to be part of that original skeleton. In other words, there's a strong possibility this passage wasn't something Khufu added. It might be something he inherited. And if that's true, then we're looking at two distinct phases of construction. An earlier phase, responsible for the deepest stones, the strange corridor, possibly the big void. A later phase, Khufu's renovation, casing, and modifications, wrapping that older core in fresh limestone and royal branding. The northern passage supports this idea in a few ways. It's cut inside the oldest stone. It's shared geometry with the star-lined shafts. Yet it doesn't connect to the known chambers those shafts serve. It's as if someone had an original design, with passages and chambers we still haven't fully mapped, and later builders copied parts of that design without fully understanding or preserving the whole thing. When the endoscope footage went public, the images were undeniable. You can't argue a corridor doesn't exist when it's literally on camera. So the official response was similar to the big void. Yes, it's real. Yes, it's interesting. No, we're not rushing to explore further. More committees, more language about caution and protection, and further study needed. And so, the corridor joined the void in a kind of archaeological purgatory. Confirmed, documented, but effectively frozen. But a freeze doesn't erase what we saw. We now have a massive void above the Grand Gallery, perfectly aligned and sealed. A narrow corridor on the northern side, carved with incredible precision, completely untouched. Both features live in the pyramid's oldest stone. Both features seem to belong to a design that's more advanced, and possibly more ancient than the official timeline allows. And neither has any mention in the texts and inscriptions we rely on to tell us who built what. That silence is its own kind of evidence. Egyptians were obsessive record keepers. They carved their achievements deep into granite and limestone. But here, no name, no dedication, no claim. If this corridor had been a proud 4th Dynasty project, do we really think they would have kept quiet about it? Or is it more likely that by the time Khufu scribes were chiseling their stories into stone, the origins of that older architecture were already forgotten, absorbed into myth, folded into stories of gods and golden ages? Which leads to the next big question. If this corridor, and maybe the big void, don't belong to Khufu, who do they belong to? To even begin answering that, we have to step away from modern instruments and listen to some of the oldest witnesses we have. Not modern archaeologists, not 19th century explorers, but people who stood at Giza 2,000 years ago and asked their own questions. People like Herodotus, Strabo, Diodorus. For centuries, their writings were treated as half myth, half mistake. But as our technology starts to confirm some of the impossible things they described, we have to wonder, what if they weren't making things up? What if they were repeating memories, distorted secondhand, but rooted in something real that even the Egyptians of their time had only half understood? To see how deep this goes, we need to go underground, into the stories of hidden lakes, buried chambers, and tunnels that twist beneath the plateau. Stories that sounded like fantasy, right up until the day seismic instruments started finding shapes in the bedrock that shouldn't be there. Sometimes the oldest evidence isn't buried deep underground. It's been sitting in plain sight for thousands of years. We just stopped taking it seriously. Before there were laser scans, muon detectors, and ground-penetrating radar, there were travelers, people who came to Egypt, stood in front of the Great Pyramid, and wrote down what they saw or what the priests told them. For centuries, modern scholars treated those accounts like half fairy tales, colorful, exaggerated, interesting but not reliable. But now, Advanced instruments are quietly starting to line up with things those unreliable writers said 2,000 years ago, which raises a very uncomfortable question. What if the myths weren't myths? What if they were memories? The most famous of these ancient voices is Herodotus, a Greek historian who visited Egypt around 450 BC. To give you some perspective, the Great Pyramid was already ancient when he got there, older to him than the Roman Empire is to us. Herodotus didn't see it being built. He couldn't talk to the original architects. Instead, he relied on Egyptian priests, custodians of temple tradition, who guided him around and told him what their records said. And what they told him was wild. According to Herodotus, the pyramid wasn't just a mountain of stone sitting on the surface. He wrote that beneath it was a network of subterranean passages, tunnels and chambers cut deep into the bedrock. At the lowest level, he said, there was an underground lake fed by a hidden channel from Nile. In the middle of that lake, a stone island. And on that island, the true burial chamber of Khufu, sealed away, unreachable, floating in darkness, surrounded by water. It sounds like something out of a fantasy novel, a secret island tomb beneath a pyramid, protected by flood engineering far beyond what we usually credit to the ancient world. So, for generations, historians essentially patted Herodotus on the head and said, nice story, symbolic, allegorical, but obviously not literal. The lake must represent the underworld. The island must be a metaphor for rebirth. Very poetic, very mythic, and then we move on. Except, Herodotus doesn't present it as poetry. He presents it as something the priests told him as fact. Institutional memory, passed down over who knows how many centuries. And he wasn't the only one hearing strange things about what lay beneath the pyramid. About 400 years later, another Greek writer, Strabo, came to Giza. He correctly described the entrance of the Great Pyramid on the northern face. So he clearly wasn't just copying myths. He was paying attention. But then he mentioned something else. A movable stone near the entrance that, when shifted, revealed a hidden passage. Through that passage, he says, you could ascend through a slippery and narrow route down to chambers beneath the pyramid. Again, the picture isn't of a simple straight tunnel and 3 chambers like tourists see today. It sounds more complex, multi-level, with clever tricks designed to confuse or conceal. Then there's Diodorus Siculus, another Greek historian from the 1st century BC. He claimed that the builders of the pyramids constructed secret vaults below the foundation. Those vaults, he said, were surrounded by channels designed to flood if intruders broke in, essentially a booby-trap system. Winding passages, false routes to mislead trespassers, final chambers buried so deep that no thief would ever find them. 3 ancient writers, all of them talking about subterranean architecture, hidden passages, flooded or flood-ready chambers beneath the pyramid. For a long time, modern Egyptologists shrugged and said, yeah, that's just what happens when outsiders talk about monuments they don't understand. But then the 20th century rolled around, and we started firing seismic waves into the ground. Seismic surveys are like sonar, but for rock. You send vibrations into the earth and measure how they bounce back. Solid limestone sends back a clear, strong signal. Water-saturated stone sends a different signature. Empty spaces, a cave, a void, a carved chamber, barely bounce anything back at all. They show up as dark spots in the data. When teams ran seismic surveys around the Great Pyramid and under the Giza Plateau, they found something awkward for its all-mythology crowd. There were anomalies right beneath the base of the Great Pyramid. The readings showed void zones, places where the rock wasn't solid, suggesting artificial spaces, chambers or tunnels. Some of those voids were rectangular or sharply edged. Nature doesn't usually carve rectangles. People do. Even more interesting, some regions return signatures consistent with moisture, water-saturated rock, exactly where everything should be bone dry. Remember, the Giza Plateau is porous limestone. Water doesn't just sit there in neat little pools under a pyramid. It drains. It moves. Unless something is holding it, like a carved basin, or a deliberately sealed chamber, or, say, an underground lake. Suddenly, Herodotus didn't sound quite so crazy. The seismic data doesn't prove there's a literal underground lake with an island tomb in the middle, but it absolutely shows artificial voids under the pyramid, unnatural concentrations of moisture, both in the general region where Herodotus said there were underground structures. So now, instead of saying, Herodotus was wrong, we have to admit, at minimum, he wasn't completely making it up. He was preserving something, maybe from older traditions, maybe from access routes that were open in his time and later sealed. And he's not alone in getting vindicated by technology. Remember Strabo and his description of hidden passages accessed by movable stones? Modern ground-penetrating radar and various scans have found signs of concealed shafts beneath the northern face of the pyramid, exactly where Strabo mentions. Some of those appear to descend at sharp angles, then level out, heading horizontally into the plateau, and then disappearing beyond the range of the equipment. Sound familiar? Diodorus talked about winding passages and trap-like designs beneath the pyramid. Muon scans and seismic work point to a more complicated internal layout than the simple three-chamber map we show tourists. Again, not proof that every detail was perfect, but enough overlap that we can't just brush them off as storytelling. So how did these Greek writers know? There are a few possibilities. 1. In their time, some lower passages were still accessible. Maybe certain entrances hadn't collapsed yet. Maybe the Egyptian priesthood still used underground areas for ritual or storage and physically showed them. Later, those routes could have been blocked, lost, or deliberately sealed. 2. The priests were preserving traditions that were already ancient when the pyramids were ancient. Imagine this. An older civilization builds complex underground structures. Centuries or millennia later, a newer culture repurposes those structures, but doesn't really know who originally built them or why. They keep a story alive anyway. Below this monument, there are vaulted passages in a lake and chambers that no one has entered since the first time. Over generations, the details get mythologized. The gods get involved. The imagery becomes symbolic, but at the core, they're describing real architecture. By the time Herodotus arrives, the priests aren't giving him a construction manual. They're giving him the last echo of something once understood and long since forgotten. That's the strange inversion we're dealing with here. The things we've been calling myths might actually be the most honest evidence we have, because myths don't usually invent precise building layouts. They don't casually throw in, oh, and there's a water-filled chamber under this one specific monument for fun. They preserve impressions, snapshots, fragmentary memories of what earlier people saw or built. And when those old stories match what modern instruments are picking up underground, we either accept that this is all one massive coincidence, or we admit that the ancients were telling us something real, and we just didn't want to believe them. Herodotus Lake, Strabo's hidden entrance, Diodorus sealed vaults. They might not be literal in every detail, but they point to a consistent idea. The Great Pyramid isn't just what we see on the surface. It has a hidden underworld, a network of chambers and passages carved into bedrock, some of them possibly flooded, many of them still sealed. And the more we scan, map, and probe, with sound, with muons, with radar, the more that old idea refuses to go away. If the ancient witnesses preserve that much truth about what's below, what else did they get right? To answer that, we have to go back to the stones. Because myths tell us it was a first time, but the rock itself, it remembers the rain. And the rain stopped long before the Pharaohs. History is written by people. Geology is written by nature. And nature doesn't care who the king was. If you want to know what a monument meant, you read inscriptions, myths, and records. If you want to know how long it's been standing in the open, you read the stone. Because stone quietly records every drop of rain, every gust of wind, every shift in climate. And at Giza, that record doesn't line up with the official story. We've already talked about Dr. Robert Schoch and the Sphinx enclosure, the deep vertical channels on those limestone walls that scream rainfall, not desert wind. But let's zoom in a bit, because this isn't just one guy with a hunch. It's a clash between two timelines. The textbook timeline, Sphinx and pyramids around 2500 BC. The climate timeline, Heavy rainfall in that region mostly between about 10,000 and 5,000 BC, strongest around 7,000 to 9,000 BC. Those Sphinx enclosure walls bear the kind of damage you get from centuries of intense, repeated storms. By Khufu's time, that climate was already gone. If the Sphinx enclosure was carved at 2,500 BC, its walls should mostly show wind erosion, horizontal striations, sand-scoured surfaces, shallow, sideways scratches. But what we actually see are deep vertical channels, rounded, water-smooth contours, patterns that match cliffs in places that have seen heavy rainfall over thousands of years. Top-down erosion, not bottom-up. Schacht's conclusion: the Sphinx enclosure is thousands of years older than the Fourth Dynasty. But he didn't stop there. He walked over to the Great Pyramid and looked at its foundation stones, the lowest levels of limestone blocks sitting right where monument meets bedrock. And there it was again, not as dramatic as at the Sphinx, but still visible. Signs of running water, subtle vertical weathering, channels that hint at a time when rain regularly slid down the faces of those blocks. The obvious question: why are stones supposedly laid around 2560 BC, showing weathering that belongs to a climate that ended before 3000 BC? Orthodox voices tried to patch the timeline. They said things like, maybe the blocks were quarried from older exposed rock that had already weathered before being used. But erosion doesn't fit neatly like wallpaper. If you cut blocks from a weathered cliff and move them, the patterns won't magically line up from one block to the next. They'd be random. At Giza, some of those weathering channels continue across multiple adjacent blocks as if the wall had been carved, then stood outside under heavy rain, then later got built around and preserved. That suggests the stones weathered in place, as part of the standing structure during a wetter era. Zoom out, and it starts to look like this. The lowest courses of the pyramid are older than the desert. They were standing when serious rain still fell on Giza. That puts their exposure back toward the tail end of the African humid period, or even earlier. Now, we're not just talking about a few centuries off. We're talking thousands of years. If that's right, then what we call Khufu's pyramid is sitting on a base that predates him by a massive margin. Maybe he added to it. Maybe he rebuilt it. Maybe he wrapped it. But he might not have started from scratch. Let's climb the structure with our eyes for a second. Stand at one corner of the pyramid and look up, down at your feet, the foundation blocks. Huge, some weighing tens of tons. Incredibly tight joins. Surfaces weathered deeply, as if they've seen ages pass. Now move your gaze upwards. The blocks get smaller, more irregular. The joints are still impressive, but not quite as surgically precise. The weathering looks shallower, more consistent with the few thousand years we expect for exposed limestone in the desert. It's like the pyramid is a vertical timeline, oldest at the bottom, younger as you go up. Architectural surveys have basically confirmed this layering. The core masonry, the internal bulk of the pyramid, is different from the outer casing stones that once made the pyramid smooth and gleaming. Core blocks, larger, older-looking, uneven surfaces, sometimes oddly shaped. Outer layers, more uniform, more standardized, more project-like in appearance. Even more interesting, in some areas, archaeologists have found evidence that certain core stones were reused, visible only where later damage exposes them. Some inner blocks show traces of earlier inscriptions, partial hieroglyphs on faces that are now buried inside the structure. That means those stones once belonged to other constructions, older temples, older monuments, maybe older phases of the pyramid itself. Later builders took them, rotated them, stacked them, and used them as fill. We already know later pharaohs did this kind of thing all the time. Ramses II is notorious for carving his name over other rulers' inscriptions, claiming statues and obelisks he didn't actually commission. So it's not hard to imagine Khufu doing a version of that with architecture, finding an awe-inspiring ancient structure, renovating it, wrapping it in new casing, adding his temples and causeways, and then history crediting him with the entire thing. Now let's talk precision. Because even if you stripped away all the myths and speculation, the measurements alone raise eyebrows. The base of the Great Pyramid is almost perfectly square. Each side is about 230 meters long. The difference in length between sides? Less than 2 centimeters. That's an error margin of under 0.01%. For a structure that big, built supposedly with copper tools, rope, wooden sledges, human eyeballs. That level of precision is crazy. And then there's the orientation. The pyramid sides line up with the 4 cardinal directions, north, south, east, west, with an error of about 3 arc minutes. That's 3/60ths of a degree. Even with modern tools, that's impressive. The standard explanation is that the builders used the stars, watching circumpolar stars rotate around the north celestial pole, tracking when they line up vertically, using that line as true north, which is doable. But to reach 3 arc minutes of accuracy, you'd need long-term observations, solid mathematical understanding, very precise sighting instruments, none of which we found direct evidence for in 4th Dynasty toolkits. Unless, of course, Khufu's engineers didn't figure out the alignment from scratch. What if they were following a pre-existing orientation? If the foundation already preserved a perfect cardinal alignment from a much earlier civilization, later builders could just match it. It's a lot easier to copy something accurate than invent it yourself. Now step inside the pyramid, into the descending passage. This narrow corridor drops from the original entrance down into the bedrock below. It runs for over 100 meters at a very precise angle, about 26 degrees. The straightness is shocking. Over that entire length, the variation is tiny, with side walls deviating by less than a fraction of an inch. Cutting a tunnel that's straight through solid limestone is not a trivial job. To do it, you'd want reliable angle measuring tools, some kind of sighting or leveling system, advanced planning and control. Again, we're looking at engineering that feels more modern surveyor than trial and error with torches and string. And then you get to the granite, the king's chamber, the relieving chambers above it, various elements inside the pyramid. These use granite blocks hauled from Aswan, hundreds of kilometers away. Some of those blocks weigh 30 to 70 tons. Tool mark analysis on certain granite pieces has turned up evidence of saws at least several meters long, leaving clean, straight cut marks. Drill holes with spiral grooves suggesting extremely efficient drilling, on the order of 1 inch of depth per revolution. Experimental archaeologists trying to replicate that with copper tools and sand have struggled to get anywhere close. Modern diamond-tipped drills can match those rates. Bronze Age tech? Not so much. None of this proves futuristic machines or anything wild like that, but it does strongly hint that the builders were using techniques and precision we do not fully understand. And that's the recurring theme. Again and again, the Great Pyramid looks less like a single, straightforward 20-year project and more like a layered system. An older, deeply weathered, perfectly aligned core. Possibly older subterranean structures carved into bedrock. Later additions, refinements, and reuses of ancient material. Architectural precision that seems inherited rather than invented overnight. The mortar between blocks even tells a similar story. Analysis shows that some lower joints use gypsum-rich mortars, consistent with very old Egyptian construction methods. Higher courses use different lime-based mixes, more in line with known 4th Dynasty practices. Different recipes, different phases, different times. So when we put all this together, a picture starts to form. Khufu may not have been the master builder of a brand new monument. He might have been the renovator-in-chief of something already ancient. A man who took over a structure whose core was older than a civilization. A structure already aligned, already carved with impossible precision. And he did what humans always do when they inherit something extraordinary from the past. He put his name on it. He put his name on it. And once his name was there, everyone after him just went with it. Scrolls, king lists, later inscriptions, modern textbooks. They all repeat the same simple version. Khufu built the Great Pyramid. But the stones don't repeat that story. They whisper something more complicated. And it's not just the Great Pyramid. There are other places in Egypt where the same pattern shows up. Structures that don't quite fit the civilization that supposedly built them. Take the Osirian at Abydos. On the surface, you see a beautiful temple from the reign of Seti I, about 3,300 years ago. But behind and below it lies something different, a massive, megalithic structure made of cyclopean blocks. The Osirian looks and feels older than the temple above it. Huge stone blocks. Simple, heavy, almost primordial design. Construction style, unlike most other Egyptian monuments. It's as if Seti's temple was built like a fancy house on top of the stone bones of a much older building. Or look at the Valley Temple next to the Sphinx. Its limestone core is made from enormous blocks, some weighing over 200 tons, fitted together with no mortar, in a style we just don't see elsewhere in classical Old Kingdom construction. Later Egyptians added granite refacing and inscriptions, but the core itself, again, it feels like something inherited, not invented. Across the Nile, at places like Saqqara and Dashur, you see similar hints. Older cores wrapped in newer stone, earlier phases buried beneath later renovations. Layer after layer, civilization after civilization, each one claiming the last one's work as their own. The deeper you go, physically and historically, the more the architecture stops looking like Egyptian as we know it and starts looking like something Egypt remembered but didn't originate. So if the stones hint at an older builder culture, how did the Egyptians themselves explain that? They actually told us. They called it Zep Tepi the first time. Zep Tepi shows up all over their sacred texts, especially in later writings that preserve very old traditions, carved on temple walls, written in religious hymns, whispered in initiation lore. The Egyptians described it as a golden age, a time when divine beings, the Nedjru, the gods, walked the earth and ruled directly. In that era, they said, the landscape was ordered. Temples were founded in alignment with the heavens. Knowledge came straight from the stars, then was embedded in stone. Later pharaohs didn't see themselves as inventors of civilization. They saw themselves as caretakers trying to live up to a lost standard. Their mission wasn't, we are the first. It was, we are trying to restore what was done right in the first time. When they built, they said they were copying ancient templates. When they oriented temples to stars, they said they were imitating patterns set long ago. Zep Tepi to them wasn't just mythic backstory. It was a real epic, pre-dynastic, prehistorical, pre-everything we normally call civilization. And how did that first time end? Not gently. Some of the most interesting clues come from the Edfu texts. Inscriptions in the Temple of Horus at Edfu, recorded in the Ptolemaic era, but based on much older priestly material. Those texts describe a world that was destroyed in a great flood, a cataclysm. They speak of an original primeval homeland of the gods, a place destroyed by water and chaos, survivors who fled and rebuilt. According to these traditions, the god Thoth, keeper of wisdom and knowledge, played a key role. Before the flood struck, he preserved sacred knowledge, cosmic laws, architecture, astronomy, divine words, and sacred measurements. He encoded them in symbols, stored them in secret places, and entrusted them to stone structures that were meant to last through destruction and beyond. So in this story, temples and monuments weren't built as random projects. They were part of a recovery plan. Imagine you know a catastrophe is coming. You can't stop it, but you can prepare for what comes after. What do you build? Something that will survive fire and water, resist earthquakes and time, stand so out of place and so precisely designed that future generations have to take notice. Something like a pyramid. This idea that the pyramids were not just tombs, but archives built before flood, doesn't just come from temple walls. It also shows up in medieval Arabic chronicles, written thousands of years after the pyramids, but preserving earlier lore. One of the most quoted is Al-Makrizi, a 15th century historian in Cairo. He wasn't making stuff up from scratch. He was compiling older accounts from Arabic, Coptic, and Greek sources, a chain of memory stretching back over 1,000 years before him. According to Al-Makrizi, the pyramids were built by a pre-flood king named Surid. Surid, he says, had a terrifying vision. The stars falling, the heavens opening, the earth overturning, a massive flood engulfing everything. Interpreters told him the dream meant two calamities would come, one of fire, one of water. So he ordered the construction of huge stone pyramids to preserve human knowledge. Inside, According to these texts, they stored sacred writings, records of medicine, astronomy and mathematics, secret knowledge of the heavens and earth. They inscribed stone, sealed chambers, and built these structures to survive whatever was coming. Not tombs, time capsules, vaults built to outlive the world. Sounds like a story, right? Except modern geology quietly says, yeah, about that flood, something did happen. Around 12,800 years ago, the Earth's climate was hammered by a sudden, violent shift. This period is known as the Younger Dryas. Temperatures plunged. Ice sheets destabilized. Sea levels fluctuated dramatically. We see a strange layer of burned material in sediment cores across multiple continents. Evidence of massive wildfires, sudden flooding and rapid sea level surges, extinctions of megafauna. Scientists debate the exact cause, an asteroid impact, multiple comet fragments, solar activity, complex feedback loops, but they largely agree on one thing. It was bad, really bad. If there were advanced coastal civilizations back then, cities built along shorelines from an earlier age of stability, they would now be underwater, hundreds of feet below the modern sea level. Most of their structures would be gone or buried under ocean sediment. But not everything would vanish. Inland monuments built on high ground, especially in stone, could endure, maybe damaged, maybe half-buried, maybe repurposed, but still there, waiting. So when medieval chroniclers talk about pre-flood kings preserving knowledge in stone pyramids, and Egyptian priests talk about those saving sacred wisdom before a deluge, and global myths tell stories of a great flood wiping out a world, and then geology says, yes, there was a global-scale climate disaster right around the time those stories point back to, you start to see a pattern. Now, put all our threads together for a second. Geological evidence suggesting parts of Giza are older than dynastic Egypt. Architectural layering showing older cores and later renovations. Ancient writers describing underground networks, lakes, and hidden chambers beneath the pyramid. Modern seismic and muon scans confirming voids and moisture where nothing should be. Egyptian myths speaking of first time, a flood, and knowledge sealed in stone. Medieval accounts saying pyramids were built as archives before a cataclysm. Geology saying a cataclysm actually happened. You don't have to believe every detail to see what they're all circling. The idea that the Great Pyramid might not just be, here lies King Khufu, do not disturb, but instead something like, here lies what we didn't want the universe to erase. Which brings us back to that 30-meter void discovered in 2017. Because if you were going to build a monument to preserve knowledge through disaster, how would you design the most important room? The archive itself? You'd probably put it in the safest location inside the structure. Keep it away from ground-level flooding. Bury it behind layers of stone with no obvious entry. Make the outer form so impressive and durable that future people protect instead of tearing it down. Now go back and look at the muon scan results. The big void sits above the Grand Gallery, deep inside the pyramid's mass, perfectly centered, sealed on all sides. It's one of the safest, most protected regions inside the entire monument. We don't know what's in there. We're not allowed to look. But if you were designing a chamber to store something you absolutely didn't want destroyed by flood, war, or time, that's exactly where you'd put it. Is it an archive from a pre-dynastic, possibly pre-flood culture? We can't prove that. Not yet. But when the myths, the geology, the physics, and the architecture all start humming the same note, you at least have to stop laughing at the idea long enough to consider it. If the Great Pyramid was built to preserve something, there's another question we almost never ask. What if it was also built to do something? We're used to thinking of it as a static object, just a giant stone triangle sitting in the sand, slowly eroding, silently existing. But some of the most intriguing research in recent years suggests the pyramid isn't passive at all. It behaves more like a device, not in the sci-fi, plug it into the wall, and power a city sense, but as a structure designed to interact with energy, sound, vibration, even electromagnetic fields, in ways we're only just starting to measure. In 2018, a group of acoustical engineers got permission to run tests inside the King's Chamber. They weren't looking for hidden doors. They were looking for resonance. Every enclosed space has a resonant frequency, or several. That's the pitch at which the space naturally vibrates, the note that makes everything hum if you excite it just right. Think of running a wet finger along the rim of a wine glass and hearing that clear, ringing tone. Same idea, just bigger. When they tested the King's Chamber, they discovered it resonates strongly around 432 hertz, a frequency just below the musical note A. Now, 432 hertz has a bit of a reputation in fringe circles. Some people call it a natural tuning, claim it's especially harmonious or beneficial to consciousness. You don't have to buy into all of that to appreciate what's weird here. At that frequency, the King's Chamber doesn't just echo, it comes alive. The granite walls amplify the sound. The air itself vibrates. The room turns into a standing wave pattern, like invisible ripples frozen in space. Sensors placed elsewhere in the pyramid picked up something even stranger. When the King's Chamber was driven at its resonant frequency, vibrations propagated beyond the chamber. Subtle oscillations showed up in the stone structure around it, including the area above the Grand Gallery, where the muon scans revealed the big void. In other words, when you sing the right note in the King's Chamber, the hidden cavity responds. You're not just ringing a room, you're energizing a system. That's not what you'd expect from a random tune chamber. That's what you'd expect from an acoustic instrument or a tune machine. To understand why this matters, we have to talk about the materials. The pyramid is mostly made of limestone. That's the bulk of its mass. Limestone is soft by comparison. It's a good insulator for sound. It tends to absorb vibrations rather than transmit them. But the King's Chamber, the relieving chambers above it, and other key internal elements are made of granite. Granite isn't just harder. It's crystalline, made mostly of quartz, feldspar, and mica. And quartz has a special trick, piezoelectricity. That's the property that lets certain crystals generate an electric charge when they're squeezed, stretched, or vibrated. Press on quartz. It produces a tiny voltage. Hit it with the right frequency so it resonates. It produces rhythmic electrical pulses. That's why quartz is used in watches, radios, and all kinds of modern electronics. Now imagine this. The King's Chamber is built out of thousands of tons of granite, around 55% quartz. You've got a huge mass of piezoelectric material, shaped into a resonant box, tuned to a specific frequency. You expose that box to constant vibrations from the Earth itself, seismic noise, microquakes, from temperature shifts, and possibly from deliberate sound stimulation in ancient rituals. What happens? You have a gigantic block of crystal-rich stone being mechanically stressed over and over at resonant frequencies. In theory, that means a chamber could generate tiny electrical effects, weak on a human scale but non-zero. Some researchers have pushed this idea further. What if the pyramid was designed as a kind of energy transducer, converting vibrational energy, acoustic or seismic, into subtle electrical or electromagnetic effects? Others take a different angle. What if the goal wasn't power in the modern sense, but consciousness? Imagine initiating someone inside a chamber deliberately tuned to resonate with their body, their brain waves, their voice. Standing in a stone box that amplifies sound in such a way that it alters your perception, your sense of time, your awareness, your inner state. We know sound can do that. Drumming can induce trance. Chant can shift brain waves. Certain frequencies affect mood and focus. Now scale that up to a room built out of resonant crystalline stone, nested inside a giant geometric structure. That's not just a tomb. That's a device for manipulating experience. And then, just when you think it can't get any weirder, physics steps in again. In 2018, a team from ITMO University in St. Petersburg modeled how the Great Pyramid interacts with electromagnetic waves, specifically in the radio frequency range. They weren't fringe researchers. They were doing a theoretical exercise in wave scattering. They built a mathematical model of the pyramid and simulated what happens when certain wavelengths hit it. What they found is this. At specific wavelengths, particularly in hundreds of meters, the pyramid doesn't just soak up radio waves randomly. It focuses them. Electromagnetic energy gets concentrated in specific regions, inside certain internal chambers. In particular, in the region corresponding to the big void above the Grand Gallery. and also in the area beneath the pyramid, near the subterranean chamber carved into bedrock. In their simulations, the Great Pyramid behaves like an electromagnetic resonator, a structure that can capture and concentrate EM fields, a little like a giant antenna tuned to particular frequencies. No one is saying the builders understood Maxwell's equations, but they may have had an empirical, functional grasp of how geometry, materials, and orientation affect energy. Because the ratios, the angles, the chamber placements, they're not random. We see a resonant acoustic system in granite, a piezoelectric potential in its crystalline structure, an electromagnetic focusing effect at certain wavelengths, a hidden cavity position right in one of those energetic hot spots. So what was it for? The orthodox answer, coincidence. The acoustics, the piezoelectric angle, the EM resonance, all just accidental side effects of building a really big stone pyramid. The alternative answer. The pyramid was designed as part of an energetic architecture, a system that tied together sound, stone, vibration, electromagnetic fields, and even the stars. Because remember, the internal shaft of the king's and queen's chambers point toward specific stars, Orion's belt Sirius, Alpha Draconis. Those weren't random points of light. They were sacred targets, linked to mythology, rebirth, and the starry destiny of the Pharaoh soul. If the pyramid is both, tuned to energy in the earth and atmosphere, and lined up with energy in the sky, starlight, stellar positions, then it starts to look less like a big grave and more like an interface between Earth and cosmos, a bridge, a node, a machine that does something at the intersection of physics and consciousness, precisely the kind of thing later cultures could easily misunderstand as just a tomb. Ancient Egyptian texts hint at this double-purpose language. They describe pyramids and temples as places where heaven and earth meet, machines in symbolic terms, for transforming the king into an Akh, a luminous, star-like being, structures where the pharaoh ascends on rays of light or rides the ladder of the sky. It sounds like poetic theology, but we now know the structure does interact with light and energy in unusual ways. In the Middle Ages, some Arab writers even claimed the pyramids glowed faintly at night. That sounds like superstition, until you realize there's a real phenomenon called triboluminescence, where certain crystals emit light when mechanically stressed or fractured. Quartz, again a major component of granite, can produce faint flashes of light when compressed or vibrated. Normally, that effect is tiny, but in a huge mass of vibrating stone, in near-complete darkness, to eyes adapted to nocturnal conditions, maybe those faint glows would look like walls coming alive. A ritual performed at the right time, with sound, vibration, and torches extinguished, could have felt like stepping inside a living star. To the people who experienced it, the stone glowed would not be metaphor. It would be memory, whether the pyramid was a spiritual initiation chamber, ancient megalithic technology tapping into earth energies, or some hybrid of science and sacred that we no longer have a category for. One thing is clear. The structure was not designed casually. Its acoustics, materials, geometry, and alignment all conspire to create effects we're only now detecting with modern instruments. And the big void, that sealed 30-meter-long space above the Grand Gallery, sits right where many of those effects converge. It's not just a random cavity. It looks like a component, part of the instrument, part of the machine. We stand outside the Great Pyramid, take photos, and call it history. But from the inside out, it might be more accurate to call it a device, one that's been humming quietly with the planet and the stars for thousands of years, even while we forgot how to hear it. All these threads we've been pulling, the geology, the myths, the muon scans, the strange corridors, start to point in the same direction, toward a conclusion a lot of people really don't want to touch. That the Great Pyramid is not what we've been told it is. Not just younger, not just older, but different, more complicated, more layered, more purposeful, and possibly holding on to something that could rewrite the origin story of human civilization. Here's the part that's both fascinating and incredibly frustrating. The people closest to the evidence know how weird this is. They're not clueless. They're not blind. The physicists working the muon data, The engineers modeling resonance, the geologists staring at erosion lines. They can see when a pattern stops looking like coincidence and starts looking like design. But between them and the stone sits a wall that isn't made of limestone. It's made of bureaucracy. After the 2017 Big Void announcement, every serious researcher wanted the same thing. More data, not wild excavation, not drilling huge tunnels. Just careful, minimally invasive ways to learn more. Ultra-thin probes, more muon scans from different positions, acoustic imaging, ground-penetrating radar targeted specifically at the void region. Instead, what they mostly got was, "Thank you. Fascinating. We'll think about it. We formed a committee." And year after year, no access. You can't say, "There is no secret chamber," because the physics already proved otherwise. So instead you say, maybe it's a structural gap. Maybe it's not important. And anyway, we're not going to look inside anytime soon. Officially, it's about protecting heritage. And to be fair, that's not a trivial concern. One bad decision, one careless drill, one structural miscalculation, and you could damage one of the most significant monuments on Earth. But at a deeper level, there's something else going on. If you open that void and it turns out to be nothing, just a weird construction cavity. Okay, awkward, but survivable if you open it and find anything that doesn't fit the narrative. Artifacts from a much earlier time, inscriptions in an unknown style, evidence of an older builder culture. Now, you're not just patching up a date in a textbook. You're detonating a foundational assumption that civilization started when and where we say it did. So instead of risking that, the system does what systems always do when confronted with something that might blow them up. It slow walks, infinite review, endless caution, procedural quicksand. The void becomes a kind of Schrodinger's chamber. Officially unknown, unofficially, please don't open it. But time doesn't stop. Even while the void stayed sealed, other studies were happening in the background. Routine, technical, not meant to stir up drama. In 2019, a hydrological survey was done around the Giza Plateau. The goal wasn't, let's prove Herodotus right. It was practical. Assess moisture beneath the monuments. Check for underground erosion. Identify any water-related threats to stability. They used a combination of seismic reflection and ground-penetrating methods to map the subsurface. Basically, bounce energy waves underground and watch how they come back. Solid rock responds one way. Holes respond another. Water-saturated zones react differently again. When they processed the data under the Great Pyramid, they found something unexpected. Beneath the base in the bedrock was a large moisture pocket. Not a random smear. Not a vague damp patch. A basin-shaped region of water-saturated limestone, roughly centered under the pyramid's footprint, like a bowl, in a place that's supposed to be dry. Remember, Giza's limestone is porous. Water doesn't like to sit there politely and form little lakes. It seeps, it flows, it disperses. If water is lingering in a consistent, defined pocket, something is holding in, like carved stone, like a reservoir, like a deliberately shaped cavity in the bedrock. Sound familiar? Herodotus' priest told him there was an underground lake beneath the pyramid, fed by a hidden Nile channel, with an island in the middle holding the real tomb. For centuries, we treated that like fantasy. Now, physics is saying, well, there's a strange, unnatural water body down there. The survey didn't stop at the water pocket. Around the edges of that moisture basin, the data showed voids, empty spaces, and some of those voids had edges that were straight, rectangular, too regular to be natural cracks or caves. These looked a lot like man-made chambers cut into the bedrock. Not, maybe there's a gap. More like, there is something with geometry down here. So, under the Great Pyramid, we now have indications of an anomalous water-saturated basin-like zone, rectilinear voids at its borders, possible tunnels or passages leading outward. The report language, of course, is careful and conservative. Anomalies, voids, zones of differing reflectivity. But if you strip away the jargon, what it's really whispering is subterranean structures, water, Chambers. Exactly the kind of underworld described by Herodotus, Diodorus, and others. We still don't know if there's a literal stone island in the middle of that underground water. We don't know if there's a sarcophagus or artifacts or something much stranger. Because, again, we haven't gone down there. But the pattern won't go away. On the surface, a massive stone monument aligned to the cardinal directions and key stars, layered with strange geometry and energetic behavior. Inside, hidden voids seal corridors, cavities where nothing was supposed to be. Below, signs of the basin of water and man-made spaces cut into bedrock. It raises a possibility we don't usually let ourselves say out loud. What if the real monument isn't the pyramid we see, but the complex beneath it? What if the above-ground structure is the lid, the marker, the pointer, like a gigantic stone arrow saying, the important stuff is under here? That would make sense if you were trying to protect something from catastrophe. Think about it. If you're worried about flood, you might dig down into bedrock and create sealed chambers protected by height and geology. But then you also might worry about the aftermath, people finding them too easily, raiding them, misusing what's inside. So maybe you flood the lower levels to create a barrier, seal the accesses and disguise them, build a giant structure on top that's so iconic and intimidating that future cultures revere it instead of dismantling it. In that scenario, the Great Pyramid is doing two jobs: acting as a seal, a protective cap over something older and deeper, acting as a beacon, so utterly impossible to ignore that future civilizations build their own myths around it, ensuring it survives. And there's another layer to this. What if the pyramid we see, the part we've mapped and toured and lit up for laser shows, is just the upper floors of a much larger vertical complex? Subterranean chambers below, resonant granite rooms in the middle, hidden voids near the top of the structural core. A stack system running from deep bedrock up toward the sky. That idea lines up eerily well with Egyptian cosmology. Do it, the underworld beneath the earth, the realm of the living in between, the sky realm above, the domain of the imperishable stars. What if the pyramid is literally built as a three-tiered diagram of that cosmic map? And what if somewhere in the middle, in that sealed 30-meter void, sits the bridge layer, the archive, the memory, the message from the first time? This is where the resistance to deeper exploration becomes more than just, we don't want to crack a stone. If we drain that water pocket, carve a shaft, or find a way into those lower chambers, and it turns out they contain artifacts from a pre-dynastic, possibly pre-flood civilization, we're not just editing Egyptian history. We're rewriting the history of humanity. We'd have to admit that we are not the first advanced culture, that knowledge, engineering, and cosmic awareness have surged and crashed more than once, that what we call progress might actually be recovery, us climbing back up a cliff others fell from long before. And maybe most humbling of all, we have to confront how completely a civilization can be erased. Imagine a culture capable of carving giant stone monuments aligned with both stars and electromagnetic principles, predicting a global-scale catastrophe, building archives meant to survive not just destruction but forgetting. And even it got buried under sand and myth so thoroughly that thousands of years later, we argue about whether they even existed. If that can happen once, why not more than once? And what does that say about us? Our satellites, our data centers, our cloud storage, our glass and steel cities. Fast forward 10,000 years. Shift coastlines. Drop a few asteroid fragments. Cook the climate. What survives? Not the servers. Not the skyscrapers. Not the TikToks. If anything makes it, it'll be the things we build in stone. The things we align with the sky. The things too heavy, too precise, and too mysterious to tear down. Exactly like how the Great Pyramid survived a catastrophe. And we're only now starting to realize it might be more than a silent tomb. It might be a mirror, showing us what happens when a civilization tries to talk to the future. And the future forgets the language. So here we are, standing at the edge of an unanswered question buried inside a 4,500-year-old, or maybe much older, mountain of stone. We've got a big void we're not allowed to enter. A hidden corridor we can see, but not explore. seismic hints of underground chambers and water basins, erosion that points to an age before the desert, myths that sound suspiciously like memories of a lost world, physics telling us the whole thing behaves like some kind of tuned device. Individually, each of those things is fascinating. Together, there's something else, a pattern. And when patterns start showing up in this many different domains, geology, acoustics, history, myth, particle physics, you either assume it's all one huge cosmic coincidence, or you take a breath and say, okay, maybe we've been looking at this wrong from the beginning. Let's zoom out. The standard story says civilization sort of switches on around 5,000 to 6,000 years ago. You get Sumer in Mesopotamia, dynastic Egypt on the Nile, the Indus Valley, later the early Chinese states, cities, writing, organized religion, monumental architecture. Before that, hunter-gatherers, small-scale farming, scattered villages. We like that narrative. It's clean. It's linear. But what if that neat slope from primitive to advanced is an illusion? What if the truth looks less like a staircase and more like a heartbeat? Civilizations rising, peaking, collapsing, leaving behind only fragments. Stone bones of the desert that later cultures adopt, adapt, and rebrand. If the core of the Great Pyramid really does belong to a much older culture, if the Big Void, the underground network, the weird acoustic and EM behavior all come from a pre-dynastic builder tradition, then Khufu isn't the start of the story. He's a chapter in the middle. And the first time the Egyptians talked about might not be a dream of the far past. It might be a distorted memory of a very real, very old civilization whose cities are now underwater or buried, whose records are locked in stone vaults we haven't opened. This idea isn't unique to Egypt. Flip through the world mythologies, and you see the same story wearing different masks. A golden age, a catastrophic flood, or fire, or both. Survivors who preserve knowledge and rebuild in a diminished world. In Mesopotamia, you have Utnapishtim in the Epic of Gilgamesh. He survives a divine deluge, saves life in a great boat, and preserves sacred knowledge from before the flood. In Sumerian accounts, kingship civilization is said to have descended from heaven multiple times, with lists of rulers from before and after a great destruction. In India, the Matsya Purana describes Manu being warned by Vishnu, in the form of fish, about a coming flood. He's told to preserve the Vedas, sacred knowledge, and carry forward into the next cycle. In Mesoamerica, the Maya speak of multiple worlds destroyed and remade. The Popova describes earlier creations wiped out, with remnants of wisdom carried forward into new ages. Over and over, in culture after culture, an advanced time, a catastrophic reset, knowledge preserved, often in stone, or in sacred texts, or in star-aligned monuments. When a story shows up in that many places, separated by oceans and languages, you can shrug and call it universal symbolism. Or you can at least consider the possibility that everyone is dimly remembering the same kind of thing. A disaster big enough to carve itself into Earth's memory and human memory. Like the Younger Dryas. Like ice sheets melting and sea levels jumping. Like coastlines flooding and entire regions becoming uninhabitable. If that happened to us, right now, how will we try to talk to whoever came after? We'd know. Servers will die. Digital storage will decay. Paper burns, rots, vanishes. Maybe we'd engrave information into durable materials, stone, ceramic, metal. Maybe we'd build giant markers in places unlikely to be completely erased. Align them with the sky so their purpose screams intentional. Maybe we'd tuck our real data, what we know about physics, astronomy, biology, inside sealed chambers designed to survive fire, water, and war. So when ancient texts, medieval chronicles, geological records, and modern scans all hint that the Great Pyramid might be one of those structures, you don't have to believe every claim to see the outline of a story. Somebody tried to talk to the future. The problem is, the future forgot how to listen. We walk to the Grand Gallery like tourists in a museum. But if the pyramid is a device or an archive, or some hybrid of temple and machine, then we're wandering through the casing of something that was never meant to be explained in a brochure. It was meant to be used. Even the Egyptians might not have fully understood it. They revered it. They inscribed around it. They incorporated it into their own religious system. But by their own admission, they were looking back at Tepe, the first time, as something already ancient in their day. They were us, looking at ruins, try and reconstruct a manual from vibes, fragments, and whatever the priesthood had managed to preserve. Egypt's own texts admit there was a gap, a break in continuity, a time when the gods withdrew, when the perfect order, the model first time, was broken, and later kings were left to try to recreate from pieces. Now we stand in the same position, looking at them, looking at something older still. We're squinting at a cosmic game of telephone played across 10,000 years. And somewhere in that game is a big void, a chamber that has sat in perfect, enclosed darkness while entire civilizations rose, fell, and argued about what its builders believed. If that void were opened tomorrow and found to be empty, no inscriptions, no artifacts, just bare stone, it would still be extraordinary. Because we have to explain why someone went to all that trouble to carve and seal a perfect, central, protected cavity that no one ever entered again. Empty doesn't mean meaningless. A tuning cavity in an instrument is empty, but it's what makes the instrument sing. A waveguide in a high-frequency device is empty, but it's where the energy flows. That sealed space could be part of the pyramid's energetic architecture, not a storeroom. On the other hand, if it isn't empty, if it contains anything, objects, inscriptions, devices, records, that clearly don't belong to Khufu's time, then we're forced to admit something we resisted for a long time. That civilization is older than we thought, that the line between myth and memory is blurrier than we like, and that what we call ancient wisdom might be the best attempt of survivors to preserve the last pieces of something even more ancient. It's tempting at this point to demand a Hollywood moment. Just drill. Just send a robot. Open the lake. Find the island. Flip the switch. But in reality, that's not how this moves. It will move slowly, through more scans, more studies, more debates. The pressure will build year after year as more data piles up that doesn't fit the neat narrative. At some point, the argument for we have to know will outweigh the argument for we have to never touch anything. And when that happens, when the first real probe goes into that cavity or into the chambers beneath the pyramid, we're going to get an answer. Maybe not the answer we've built in our heads, but an answer. And whatever it is, it will tell us something about ourselves that we badly need to hear. Because ultimately, this isn't just a story about stone and rain and muons. It's a story about memory. How much can be lost? How little can survive? And how much meaning can be locked into something as simple as a sealed room, waiting for a species to get curious enough and humble enough to open it? We spent all this time talking about the stone, the scans, the myths, the physics. But there's one more layer we haven't really touched yet. Us. Because the real question isn't just what the Great Pyramid is. It's whether we're the kind of civilization that can handle the answer. Think about how we react to uncomfortable truths now about much smaller things. New evidence comes out that challenges a popular theory, a familiar narrative, a cherished belief. What happens? People dig in. Institutions defend themselves. Algorithms reward outrage, not curiosity. Now scale that up to something like this. Hey! The most famous monument on Earth might have been built by people we don't remember, using knowledge we don't understand, after a disaster we barely acknowledge, for purposes we haven't figured out. That's not just a tweak to a timeline. That messes with identity. We like the story where we're the pinnacle, the smartest, the most advanced, the inevitable result of a long upward climb. We do not like the story where we're one of several attempts, where someone else got here first, maybe farther, and then lost almost everything, because that means civilization isn't a ladder. It's a cliff, and we're standing on the edge, looking down at the ruins of whoever fell before us. The Great Pyramid. If it really is an archive from that earlier climb, forces us to imagine that scenario in a very real way, not as a movie, not as a myth, as a physical possibility. Someone had advanced astronomy, engineering on a ridiculous scale, long-term planning across generations, enough self-awareness to say, we might not make it, but maybe our knowledge can. And even they couldn't stop whatever hit them. Even they got pushed back to almost zero. If we confirm that, if we open that chamber and find proof of a pre-dynastic, possibly pre-flood culture, that's going to do something to us. Some people will celebrate, so will deny it no matter what. Some will say, see, my myth was right all along, and try to turn it into a weapon in culture wars. It's going to get messy. But underneath that chaos, something important will be happening. We'll be forced to see ourselves in a different time scale, not as inevitable, permanent owners of the planet, but as one iteration in a very long experiment. And that, weirdly, might be the most valuable thing an ancient archive could give us. Not just secret knowledge, or lost tech manuals, or cosmic diagrams. Perspective. The kind you only get when you can say, we are not the first to face global instability. We are not the first to stand at the edge of a climate shift. We are not the first to build wonders and think they'll last forever. If the Great Pyramid really is a message from a world that went through its own collapse, then whatever's hidden in that void, if anything is, might not be about how to build machines, but how to avoid becoming a ruin. Maybe it's star maps that show alignments from a sky slightly different to ours, proving its age, records of ocean levels and coastlines now underwater, warnings carved into symbolism, explaining what happens when you push your environment too far. A blueprint not of technology, but of balance, how they try to live in sync with cycles we've forgotten. Or maybe it's simpler. Maybe it's just a testament. We were here. We knew the stars. We built in stone. We remembered the flood. And we wanted you to know that you're not starting from zero. That alone would change how we look at everything. Our myths, our religions, our science, and our future. But there's a darker possibility, too. What if that chamber was designed to never be opened? Not because of danger in the Hollywood sense. No curses, no traps, no ancient pathogens waiting to break loose. But because the builders knew something about us, about humans, that the more power we have without wisdom, the more likely we are to burn ourselves down. Maybe they calculated that whoever found their work would need to hit a certain threshold before they went poking around inside. A certain level of technology, a certain level of global communication, a certain level of maturity. The tech? We've got that. We can see through stone with cosmic rays. We can map underground structures without digging. We can model the way a pyramid interacts with energy fields from thousands of kilometers away. The communication? Also there. If something world-shifting comes out of that chamber, everyone will know about within hours. The maturity? That's the big question mark. Because imagine the headlines if tomorrow someone pushed a borehole through the void ceiling and streamed the first images. Whatever's inside would instantly be claimed, interpreted, weaponized in debates, wrapped in conspiracy theories, turned into memes. Governments would argue over ownership. Religious groups would claim validation or feel threatened. Institutions would scramble to spin it in ways that don't undercut their authority. In that chaos, the actual meaning of what we found could easily get lost. We'd be so busy fighting over whose past it is, we'd miss what it says about our future. And yet, that's kind of the point of this entire series of questions, isn't it? Not just, is there a hidden chamber? But, are we ready to look in the mirror it's been holding up for thousands of years? Because that's what the Great Pyramid is at this point. A mirror to our arrogance, thinking we figured it all out. To our fear of truths that might destabilize our worldview. To our curiosity, the stubborn little fire that keeps going, even when we're told, don't ask that. The stones remember the rain. They remember hands carving passages we've never walked. They remember a sky slightly different, over a world with lakes where there is now desert. They remember a story that we've only been reading from the last few pages. And inside that sealed space, inside that 30-meter void that muons trace like a ghost, there's another blank page, waiting. If there is nothing in there but air and silence, that tells us something about the design, about how the builders thought of function and resonance and structure. If there's something in there, anything man-made, then that page suddenly fills with ink, dates, styles, knowledge, questions we haven't even thought to ask yet. Either way, opening it is less about treasure and more about context. Who were we before we were human history as we know it? What did we once know that we had to relearn the hard way? What mistakes did they make that we're about to repeat? You can feel, even now, how close we are tipping into that next era of understanding, and how desperately parts of our system want to keep things as they are. But history doesn't freeze. Even when people try to lock it in place, reality has a way of seeping through cracks. Just like water found its way into the bedrock beneath the pyramid. Just like muons found their way through 6 million tons of stone to outline a space no one had seen in 4,000 years. If the builders of that monument could still speak, maybe they'd laugh at how scared we are to ask the obvious questions. They might say, "We built this for you, not your textbooks, not your institutions. You, the ones who look up at the night sky and feel the pull of a mystery that doesn't fit in documentaries." And they might add one more thing. The door is still closed because you haven't really decided whether you want the answer or just the illusion that you already know it. The desert doesn't care. The sky doesn't care. The pyramid definitely doesn't care. It will keep standing there, indifferent and patient, while we figure ourselves out. But night is falling on the plateau again. The question is still waiting. And in the final part of this story, we're going to step back into that darkness, to the silent plateau, the cooling stone, and the unseen chamber, and leave the Great Pyramid exactly where it has always been, on the edge between what we know and what we're finally brave enough to ask. Night settles over the Giza Plateau. Again, the last voices fade. Tour buses roll away. The Souvenir stands close to their shutters. What's left is what has always been left when the noise dies. Stone, silence, and a question. The Great Pyramid becomes itself again when nobody's watching. No lights, no commentary, no explanations printed on plaques. Just 6 million tons of rock, glowing faintly under starlight, holding its shape against time and sand and the slow breathing of the desert. Somewhere inside that bulk, unseen and untouched, there's a space no human has entered in thousands of years. Muon scans trace its outline like the ghost of hall above the Grand Gallery. 30 meters long, perfectly centered, deliberately sealed. A void, not just an absence of stone, but the presence of decision. Someone chose to carve that space. Someone chose to close it up. Someone chose to leave it there, inside a monument that would outlive their language, their cities, their entire world. We don't know who they were. We have names for the Egyptians who later claimed the pyramid. We have their kings' lists, their myths, their funerary texts. But for the original hands that shaped the deepest stones, cut the strangest passages, engineer the most precise alignments, we have no names. Just evidence. Evidence in the rock. The erosion that says some parts of this site once stood in an age of rain. The foundation stones that remember a climate older than the desert. Evidence in the structure. The layering that hints at older cores wrapped in younger casing. The corridors that exist but weren't recorded in any known plan. The shaft that aim at specific stars like frozen beams of intention. Evidence in the physics. The resonance of the king's chamber, humming at frequencies that turn it into an instrument. The electromagnetic models showing how certain wavelengths focus in specific regions, including around the hidden void. Evidence underground. The seismic signatures of chambers and tunnels beneath the base. The basin of moisture trapped in bedrock where no water should pool. A quiet echo of Herodotus' underground lake. Evidence in human memory. Egyptian myths of Zep-Tepi, the first time when divine beings walked the earth and built in harmony with the sky. Temple texts describing a catastrophic flood, and knowledge preserved in stone. Medieval chroniclers repeating stories of pre-flood kings who built pyramids as archives. Global flood traditions that all seem to be remembering the same kind of wound. None of these alone is a smoking gun. Together, there's something more like a constellation. You can stare at random stars and see nothing, or you can trace lines between them, and suddenly there's a shape looking back at you. Right now, the Great Pyramid is that constellation. Dots of data, lines of story, a shape that looks suspiciously like this. We are not the first. Not the first to look at the sky and map it in stone. Not the first to fear that the world, as we know it, could end. Not the first to try to send a message forward across millennia, hoping someone, someday, would be able to read it. That's the real heart of this mystery. Not whether there's gold in that void. Not whether we'll find a mummy in some secret vault. The real question is, did someone from a world older than ours manage to say, "We were here. This is what we learned. Don't make our mistakes"? And if they did, will we listen? It's easy from a distance to treat all of this as entertainment. A good story, a spooky documentary, something to put on in the background while you scroll your phone. But there's a version of the future where that hidden chamber is finally opened, carefully, methodically, with the whole world watching. Maybe the camera snakes inside and reveals bare stone, a tuning cavity, a resonant heart, an architectural silence that proves the builders understood something about energy and form that we're only beginning to rediscover. Or maybe the light lands on carved walls, symbols we recognize and symbols we don't, star maps that don't match our current sky, records of coastlines that are now deep under the sea. Maybe we see clear evidence that while our ancestors were supposed to be hunting with stone tools, somebody else was building with mathematical, astronomical, and engineering sophistication we hadn't imagined. Or maybe it's something in between, a mix of the familiar and the alien. Enough to prove the timeline wrong, but not enough to answer every question it raises. Whatever's in there, here's what it will not be. Simple. Because nothing about this monument has ever been simple. We, on the other hand, love simple. Khufu built it as a tomb. Aliens did it. It's just a pile of rocks. It's a power plant. We reach for extremes because they're easy. The truth might be something stranger. A monument built across phases. Old cores, new shells. Spiritual motives blended with practical ones. An archive and a machine, and a temple and a cosmic symbol, all at once. The kind of complexity that doesn't fit neatly in one documentary, one textbook paragraph, one YouTube title. But if there's one place on Earth that deserves a complicated answer, it's this one. So where does that leave us right now? You, me, and a pyramid that will probably still be standing long after both of us are gone. It leaves us with a part of the story that is ours. We don't control what's in that chamber. We don't control how old those deepest stones really are. But we do control how we meet the mystery. With arrogance, we already know it's all solved. With fear, don't ask, don't look, don't challenge a narrative. Or with something else. Curiosity and humility at the same time. The ability to say, okay, maybe we don't know everything yet. Maybe the people who came before us, whoever they were, deserve a little more respect than we've been giving them. Maybe the myths we've been calling stories are actually the last surviving embers of real history. That mindset, that's what opens doors. Sometimes literally. Because here's the funny thing. Institutions move when enough people start asking better questions. The more we care, the more we push for real exploration, real transparency, real science instead of tidy sound bites, the harder it becomes to keep places like that void in permanent, pending review mode. So if this story has lit something up in you, that itch that says, wait, I want to know, I want to really know, that matters. That's the same itch that led physicists to point muon detectors at a rock pile everyone said was already understood. The same itch that sent geologists to read the rain scars in stone. The same itch that made ancient scribes carve memories into temple walls and chronicles, hoping somebody in the future would still be paying attention. You're part of that chain now. And if you want to keep following it, down hidden corridors, into sealed chambers, through old myths and new scans, you know what to do. Subscribe if you haven't already. Drop your theory in the comments. Is a void an archive? A tuning component? A burial that predates Egypt? Or something we haven't even imagined yet? I read what you write. And sometimes the wild theory in the comments section is just a question nobody in academia was brave enough to say out loud. The Great Pyramid isn't going anywhere. It'll be here tomorrow, next year, 1,000 years from now, if we're lucky enough to still be asking questions. But right now, in this moment, as night folds over the plateau and the stars will into place above it, we're closer than any generation has ever been to hearing its answer. We can see its hidden spaces without breaking its skin. We can model its behavior with physics the builders might have known only by intuition. We can compare its story to global myths and geological records in a way no ancient priest or medieval historian could. All that's left is to decide who we're going to be when the next door opens. The ones who cling to the old story no matter what, or the ones who take a deep breath, look into that chamber, whatever it holds, and say, okay, show us what we forgot. Until then, the pyramid waits. Silent, patient, a question in stone, watching the sky, waiting for us to remember that the past isn't finished yet.